If we can describe the Emperor Joseph II as an enlightened despot or Jacobin autocrat, to the point that his name has become a byword for the Austrian Enlightenment, his brother and successor, the Emperor Leopold II, was more enlightened, less despotic. While Joseph II's methods were crude, Leopold's were devious. One could go so far as to say that he represented absolutism through subterfuge. Though his reign was brief, of less than 2 years, these were the pivotal years, the years that coincided with the escalating radicalism of the French Revolution, from the storming of the Bastille to the execution of King Louis XVI. Leopold was left with the fallout of his brother's poor politicking, and yet he was as committed, if not more so, to the ideals of Josephinism, though exhibiting more tact and subtlety. The mission of the reforming monarchy, the revolution from above, would continue. His premature death in 1792, at the age of 44, is often presented as the great what if of the Habsburg monarchy, since his son and successor, the Emperor Francis, directed Austria's efforts to contain and ultimately defeat the forces of the French Revolution. Born in 1747, Peter Leopold had little prospect in succeeding to the emperorship, given that he had two elder brothers, Joseph and the Archduke Charles. The early death of Charles gave Peter Leopold an opportunity for practical experience of government. Following the death of his father, Francis, the Habsburg inheritance was divided, a system known as secundogeniture. Joseph II received the Holy Roman Emperorship, while his mother continued to rule the Habsburg monarchy. Leopold inherited the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, the former domain of the Medicis in the heart of Italy, and the crown jewel of the Habsburg possessions next to Milan in Lombardy. Peter Leopold found Tuscany ruined by over a century of mismanagement and corruption. Florence, once the center of the Italian Renaissance and banking capital of Europe, was now a relative backwater. Leopold attempted to transform the region into an asset for the dynasty and a personal power base, establishing a more benign system of government that banned the use of torture, the death penalty, and even took measures to address mental illness in line with the principles of the Enlightenment and new innovations in medicine. This in contrast with the despotic reigns of the later Medicis. In that vein, he attempted a dramatic transformation of the duchy's legal and political system, inspired by the American Revolution and his reading of Montesquieu's Spirit of Laws. He envisioned a new representative system of government modeled after the Virginia Constitution. Had this effort succeeded, Leopold's Tuscany would have been the first state in Europe to have created what we would recognize as a modern codified constitution. Predictably, this initiative was opposed by all the orders of Tuscany, the nobility, and the church, who risked the loss of their privileges, as if you could take the spirit of America and impose it into the middle of Italy. His efforts against the Catholic Church were motivated in part to seize the wealth of their lands and to suppress their monasteries to aid his destitute administration. In 1786, Leopold, through his bishop Ricci, convoked the Synod of Pistoia, influenced by French Gallicanism and Febronianism, both attempting to nationalize the church in Tuscany while attempting to reconcile the differences between Protestants and Catholics. The synod was also influenced by the Jansenists, a Catholic movement with crypto-Calvinist elements, renowned for their deep hostility to the absolute monarchy in France. Once emperor, Leopold implemented the policy of placet regium in furtherance of these Gallican ideas, ensuring that dogmas of the Church could only be introduced into Austria with the emperor's explicit consent. Though the Synod of Pistoia's decrees were nullified after Leopold's death, the efforts to lead church reform in Tuscany, adjacent to the heart of papal power in Rome, at a time when other secular rulers had succeeded in pressuring the papacy to suppress the Jesuit order, demonstrates the confidence of Leopold to challenge the old Catholic order in Europe for the favour and furtherance of secular governance. A zeal complemented by the reforms of Joseph II in Austria. Many of the Grand Duke's "enlightened" initiatives had failed partly thanks to the fact that Leopold lacked any real coercive power. Nevertheless, the absence of an army allowed for Leopold to follow the cameralist model of Austria and direct state investment towards the economy, which saw gradual improvement. This factor, alongside the penal moderation of the Leopold regime, can help explain why his government survived the alienation of the Church and his own personal unpopularity. Indeed, if you consider the lack of coercive power, that can also inform his own style of government when he inherits the position of Holy Roman Emperor. Nevertheless, he was so invested in his Italian realm that he hesitated to rush to his brother's side as the emperor succumbed to his final illness. Leopold relinquished his control of Tuscany to his younger son Ferdinand and assumed the mantle of Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and sovereign of the Habsburg monarchy. Joseph II had succeeded in alienating the nobility through his micromanagement, his despotism, his disdain for local customs and privileges, his abolition of serfdom, and his attempts to impose uniform bureaucratic government open to all ranks. Joseph II arguably had been more ambitious or more courageous in curtailing his nobility, while his enlightened contemporaries, Frederick and Catherine the Great, had the foresight to secure noble privileges to foster a service nobility. Leopold inherited the legacy of this animosity of the nobility towards the monarchy, but moreover, a rebellious Hungary and Belgium and a disastrous war with the Ottoman Empire. Dealing with Hungary, Leopold quickly rectified the situation, or to use a phrase he instructed towards one of his governors, nip the mischief in the bud, agreeing that all Austrian sovereigns would receive a Hungarian coronation, during which they would confirm the rights of the Hungarian magnates. The emperor was duly crowned in November of 1790. He also led efforts in forcing recently freed serfs back into servitude. Joseph's attempts at abolishing the Rabota, or corvée labor service, were reversed. It is clear, nevertheless, that Leopold saw this as a temporary measure, purchasing time during a period of extreme duress for the monarchy. In spite of his promise, Leopold appealed to the rights of the South Slavs, the Croatians and the Serbians within the lands of Hungary by convening an Illyrian chancellery. Illyrianism, so it happens, would be seized on later by Napoleon to justify the expansion of the French Empire into the Adriatic Sea. Leopold continued the centralizing policies of his brother, appealing once more to the German Bürgerliche, middle-class town dwellers in the major towns in Hungary. In appealing to the middle classes and ethnic minorities, Leopold was enacting a policy of divide and rule, setting up client groups with which to pressure the Hungarian magnates into backing down and acceding to reforms once Leopold had consolidated his position. Reculer pour mieux sauter, to withdraw to later make a more profound impression. Leopold had welcomed the French Revolution, initially as he had welcomed the American Revolution. Austria was still technically allied with France since the diplomatic revolution of 1756, and Marie Antoinette, the emperor's sister, was the Queen of France. However, as the situation in France worsened with the Women's March on Versailles and subsequent incidents, the emperor was forced to concede that the French revolutionaries despised the alliance with Austria and their Austrian queen. and that measures must be taken to secure the Austrian border with France and Belgium and to protect Marie Antoinette. That is not to say that Leopold didn't go out of his way to dissemble. He had no desire to be drawn into conflict with France. He was far more concerned that any conflict in the West would allow his ally, Russia, to annex lands in Poland, something which would ultimately transpire a year after his death with the Second Partition of Poland in 1793. The pleas of French émigrés fell on deaf ears. Leopold rebuffed the interventionist intrigues of the Comte d'Artois, the king's brother. Austria's greatest ally was also her greatest adversary, and the emperor was satisfied that the situation in France weakened her and drew other powers like Great Britain into Austria's orbit for the sake of containing the revolution. My own interpretation of Austria's motives during the king and queen's flight to Varennes is that Leopold could satisfy Marie Antoinette's pleas for safety by placing the royal family under the emperor's protection in Belgium, while helping foment civil war in France. The failure of the flight only intensified the anti-Austrian feeling in France. In Belgium itself, Leopold had attempted to defeat the Brabant Revolution by pitting the Flemish and Walloons against each other and granting major concessions. When this failed, the situation in France called for a swift military solution. The revolutionaries in Belgium were defeated by the emperor at the Battle of Phalomel. Austria in 1791 was effectively surrounded by adversaries. She had been drawn into conflict with the Ottomans by Catherine the Great and served as a glorified diversion while Russia acquired territory. To offset any potential Austrian gains, the Prussians touted the possibility of a Prusso-Ottoman alliance against Austria. The emperor rescued himself by making peace with the Turks at Sistova. At Pillnitz, the emperor and the king of Prussia signed an interventionist declaration against France. The Franco-Austrian alliance was dead, and Austria entered into a fraught and unstable alliance with Prussia. Had the emperor succeeded in his intrigues with the flight to Varennes, he might have bought Austria enough time to either prevent the dissolution of Poland at the hands of the Russians and Prussians, or secure Austria a larger share of the inevitable partition. The failure of the flight instead placed Austria and France on a collision course, denying the emperor the time he desperately needed. The emperor was also out of time, and he died in March of 1792. The cruel irony was that Leopold was a rather notorious hypochondriac, which downplayed his doctor's impression of the severity of the fever that killed him. Within 2 days he was dead, a sudden and unexpected shock to an empire at a crossroads. Leopold had laid the foundation of the First Coalition against France, when France declared war against Austria only a month after his death. He had vicariously contributed to the empire through his 16 children, ensuring that Austria had a glut of archdukes and thus potential heirs for the remainder of the empire's existence. Nevertheless, his and his brother's project of enlightened absolutism was the casualty of Austria's 2-decade-long struggle against France and the forces of the revolution. The war makes the counterfactual of the continuation of an enlightened liberal agenda for Austria, had Leopold survived, less compelling. Catherine the Great herself turned against the legacy of the Enlightenment when, in her eyes, it amounted to a sword directed at the heart of Europe's royalty. Perhaps a longer-lived Leopold would resemble more of an Alexander I of Russia, a liberal by temperament, an expert in dissimulation, compelled to lead a crusade against the militant theme on a variation of his own philosophy.